work as a supervisor at a jail. I see some messed up stuff from time to time. I've grown to be much smarter about things, but the story I'm about to tell you is from when I was brand new supervisor. Complacency can be deadly. We had an inmate for legal reasons and for anonymity. We'll call him Joe. Joe has been in and out of this jail, not as much as an inmate, but in our protective custody program. This is when someone has a little too much to drink or gets too high and doesn't have a safe place to sober up, or may commit a crime under the influence. We provide a safe environment for them to sober up, have a warm bed, although it may not be the most comfortable, and a meal while they sober up. They are not charged with any crime, so they can be released upon being sober or within 12 to 24 hours and given a ride home. Joe had been in too many times and clearly has mental health issues. He likes to drink. That's his vice. Every time Joe comes in, we usually have to fight him and restrain him for our safety and his. Well, the local PD didn't get to Joe in time to prevent him from committing a crime one day on one of his drunken escapades, so Joe came in charged. This means he'll have to stay, have a bail hearing, then either be bailed or held depending on the judge's evaluation of his likelihood to re-offend. The first night, Joe was the same as he always was. I was used to handling him at this point. He got his bail hearing the next day and was held on preventative detention, which means he can't make bail and he is almost certain to re-offend if he was released. His court date was set. Over the course of the next month, I would come to realize how severe his mental illness was, and believe me, I wish I had paid attention to the signs earlier. Joe would make requests that were out of my control and could not be granted. When Joe got no for an answer, he would defecate into his hand and smear it all over his cell. This would happen at least 2 times a day. You see, something that took us a while to catch on to is when Joe first realized he wasn't being released, he would hide his shit behind the toilet, packed into the bed supports, in any area he could find. That way he could use it later when he got upset with someone. We always dealt with it the same. We would spend the time needed to verbally de-escalate Joe and use well-thought manipulation tactics to convince him he should clean up his cell. This would work most of the time. Something I can't confirm or prove, but I have suspicions of, is Joe may have had knowledge of the techniques being used to avoid physical contact with him, and when he complied, I believe he had a bigger plan at hand. One shift prior to mine, Joe escalated and would not comply with requests to clean his cell. The next step is use of force when officer presence and verbal de-escalation fails, is what we refer to as soft hand techniques, such as OC spray and restraints. In other words, he got sprayed with a powerful pepper spray and was given verbal commands to place his hands in his food slot so an officer could cuff him prior to removing him from the cell to have it cleaned. It's just safer for the officer and keeps the escalation of force as low as possible. Joe resented every bit of law enforcement, including those of us at the jail. I believe this event is when he started to premeditate something far more sinister than his artwork with his own shit. After that event, his behavior drastically improved for like 3 days solid. Toward the end of my shift one day, he requests a shower. This is where my complacency really bit me in the ass, and I should have known better. The shower in the area he was housed in was separate from his room. He was housed in an observation unit on 23-hour lockdown. He had a toilet and a bed in his cell, and it was only him. Because his behavior was so good recently, I allowed him out of his cell to use the shower. I don't like this part of the job, but I am required to supervise this because of his instability and because he can't be locked into the shower room on that unit. He stands behind a shower curtain and I block the doorless exit and make sure no female officers enter the unit while he's showering. He's a talkative fellow, and we were having a conversation about his love for camping. It was actually nice to have a conversation with him where he seemed relatively stable. I had high hopes for his recovery, honestly, at this point. He got out of the shower and got dressed, and the conversation continued. Then, it just stopped. He looked at the floor. I reviewed the cameras later. It all happened in a matter of 5 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. I recognized his change in behavior and knew right away I was in trouble. I'm much bigger than him, and I am trained and practice martial arts regularly, but this was the first time as a supervisor I was allowed anything to get to this point where I would need to use those skills in a situation where the inmate was mentally unstable, not in his cell, and it was just me and him. He looked back up at me, postured himself, and started yelling. I bladed my stance, and as I was doing this, he swung his left arm, headed straight for my jaw. My training paid off, as I deflected his attack and managed to gain control of his wrist and apply pressure to his tricep in an attempt to control him. I executed this perfectly, but he used his free arm to grab the shower curtain, and the pain portion of compliance was not affecting this guy at all. Now here's the problem. I'm wrestling with this guy in an area with no camera control, where they can't see me, and both my hands are being used to control this guy. I can't radio for backup, so, instead, I start yelling, "Call a code! Call a code!" hoping someone will hear me. He chose the best time to play out his plan. This portion of the shift, we were short-handed, and the officers all were doing things. The control officer heard these calls and had known of this inmate prior to his behavior. Man, I'm so glad he was paying attention, because I would later find out how much danger I was actually in. I wrestled this guy back to his cell, and he fought me hard the whole way. By the time I got him in the cell, another officer arrived. That officer controlled his upper body, while I controlled his lower body, using a leg lock to create a pain compliance until he voluntarily cuffed up. Once we got him in cuffs, other officers arrived, and I gave them instructions on what to do. We got the restraint chair, as he was still trying to fight us, and moved him into it. He was shaking his head violently and resisting all attempts to put the restraints on. The officer that first got there wound up getting bit in the process. While restraining his ankles, I noticed something. He had something in his sock. At some point, he had broken the shielding over a camera. When he did this, he kept a PICU of it and had turned it into a shank and hidden it in his clothing. It really dawned on me then. He wanted to kill me that morning. I was the target of what I believe was premeditated rage. He had every intention to kill me that morning, had my training not been as fluid as it was. I wouldn't be here today. For any other law enforcement working behind the walls, just remember, when admin tells you complacency kills, they're not joking. It really can kill you. In my town, there used to be an abandoned prison, which has since been torn down. It was in the middle of the woods, and it wasn't the kind of place you just end up at accidentally. Every once in a while, police would patrol around it, but for the most part, they just let the barbed wire fences do their job. Now, this wasn't a high-security prison for serial killers or anything, but it held robbers and rapists and the like up until about 8 years prior to the incident. It was unsettling during the daytime, especially as so much of it had been left behind, as if the place was abandoned in a hurry, but it was downright creepy at night. Well, in high school, my friend Nick and I loved exploring. We went all over, including to the abandoned mental hospital that was only a couple of miles from the jail. Growing up in the area, we knew that there was a small hole under the fence in one area, which was the only way to access the jail. One night, we made the normal trip under this hole and were walking around the area outside of the jail. We were moving as quietly as we could because, as I said before, occasionally police would patrol the area. They just parked their cars at the opposite side of the fence from where we entered, so we wouldn't be able to see them if they were there. Eventually, we were pretty sure there were no police officers, so we began to be a little louder and turned on our flashlights. I should mention now that, other than the occasional policeman who parks his car outside of the fence, we had never seen another person anywhere near the jail, let alone inside of the fenced area. We were hesitant to enter the jail itself, first of all because of how scary it is at night, and second because it's a pain in the ass to get into the jail itself during the daytime, let alone at night. So instead, we kind of just walked around the outside for a while as we normally do, scaring ourselves for the fun of it. Anyway, eventually we start to work up the courage to go inside of the jail, so we make the long trip to the other side of it where we knew one entrance was. We're walking along the side of the jail where the cells were, which had these huge windows. These were so that from the outside, when the jail was in use, you could see all of the inmates and what they were doing. As we're walking, out of nowhere, a light turns on from inside one of the cells that we were only feet away from. We can't really see anything inside, just the one beam of a flashlight which first points upwards, then turns directly at us. At first, we just froze in fear. As I said before, we'd never seen anyone in there before. Who would be sitting inside of a cell, totally silent and in darkness, as a couple of teenage boys walked by? We couldn't imagine that it was a fellow thrill seeker like us. It was not the kind of place you'd sit alone in the dark in. A homeless person? No, we didn't think he'd have a flashlight, and anyway, we assumed that cops must look through the inside during the day, every once in a while. A police officer? No way. There was no reason he would be sitting inside of the building, waiting. Well, he would have known we were there for a long time. After a few seconds, we sprinted as fast as we could away. I didn't even turn around to see if we were being followed or anything. We just found the hole under the fence and got out of there. So we wonder to this day, who was sitting inside of an abandoned jail cell in the dark, presumably watching two teenage boys walk around outside, then waiting only until they were feet away from them to announce his presence by turning on a flashlight. I'd assume we'll never know the answer to that question, and I don't really want to know. We never went back at night, and the place is gone now. I'm a female corrections officer in a state with a relatively high number of death row inmates. However, few executions are actually carried out. I used to work for a large county, but I work for a different agency now. This county was my first CO job years ago, and before that I had worked in retail and customer service while studying criminal justice, so I was really green. I used to be very liberal. I'm still liberal about a lot of things, but the job does change your perspective for most people. One thing that I used to believe very strongly was that no human being could be truly evil. This particular county jail is one of the oldest in the country, so parts of it have a totally linear layout. What I mean is that you have a long stretch of corridor with cells on either side, and the COs have to walk up and down to supervise the inmates. As you can imagine, these linear layouts are not in style anymore because you cannot see every cell at the same time, but every inmate can see you. I have to say that units like this are extremely creepy too. I'm going to call this corridor the condos. We didn't call it that, but I don't want to share the exact term which is specific to this jail. Less than 10 years ago, a quadruple stabbing homicide happened not far from where I grew up. The murderer, Michaels, described it as a butchering, and he killed his former girlfriend, her family, and their neighbor, all because he came over when he heard the screams. When the police found Michaels, soaked in blood, and asked him what had happened, he said, "It's obvious. I just killed everyone." The cop said that he seemed completely emotionless when he said it. At that time, I had only been a CO for about 4 months, and our facility received him as a pre-trial detainee. Now obviously he wasn't our first or only murderer, but the nature of this crime, stabbings indicate a more dangerous personality than a shooting for one thing, and his lack of remorse was horrifying. He was considered a volatile inmate, so we placed him in an observation cell in the middle of the condos where a CO could always keep an eye on him. He would stand at his glass door in silence most of the day, just watching everyone. I swear, he only really spoke when he had visits. He actually had a full visit list of these big goth girls who would come in and swear they were in love with him. I don't know if this means anything, but his ex was a big girl, and he used to draw pictures of the fat female COs. One day, I was working as a utilities officer, basically a floater who relieves people for breaks and helps out as needed. At this jail, utilities officers also got away with a ton of downtime and BSing. I was hanging out at one end of the condos where you could look down and see a lot of the jail, talking to another officer on duty. As they say, there are no secrets in jail. Plus, I was aware that there were points throughout the jail where you could hear very well into neighboring cells, that sort of thing. We were being pretty quiet, though. Plus, we stood a good 50 yards from Michael's observation cell. Also, you have to imagine it would be difficult to stand in the observation cell and press your face against the glass to see the people standing out at a right angle so far from you. I was telling the other CO a funny story about my weekend, which I wouldn't do out on a correctional unit nowadays, but we weren't getting into anything too personal either. It was a long story involving my fiancée at the time. I wrapped up talking to the CO because I had to go to the gate to relieve another officer for chow, and I had to pass Michael's cell. I didn't like walking past it because he stood there and stared at you, and back then, I wasn't so good at hiding my nervousness. He always had his head slightly tilted down so you could see white under his irises. Again, rarely saying a word. But today was different. I took one step past his door, and I heard him say, "Edgecombe," in a barely audible whisper. I didn't even know he knew my name. Yes, our last names are on our uniforms, but I was never his primary officer, and we'd never interacted. It caught me off guard, so instead of ignoring it, it stopped me in my tracks, and I backpedaled to the door. He pointed to his mouth, and I leaned in to listen. His eyes looked so dark. I remember I felt hypnotized. He proceeded to recite word for word the story I had just quietly told the other officer at the end of the condos less than 2 minutes before, even copying the sound of my voice down to a subtle lisp. This seemed to go on forever. I felt like we were the only two there. No 22 millimeters of glass protecting me. Just a 5-foot-tall female and a murderer. I remember thinking for the first time of another human being. This is evil and unfixable. Finally, I said, "Sir, did you need something?" He started to laugh hysterically, and I walked away. I have been assaulted by other inmates. I've had piss thrown in my eyes. People play mind games with me constantly. Now, I work at a maximum security institution where I babysit all rapists and murderers and pedophiles. I don't know how to make it make sense to you that this was the one and only time in my life where I felt inside of me like I was dealing with something not human. Michaels is in another institution now. He's on death row. He refuses to appeal. He made it clear to the press that this decision is not out of remorse. He has none. He just doesn't give a shit, and it's the most logical thing in his mind for him to die.